Welcome to Confessions of Dark Fiction. I'm your host, and today I bring you a story that will test your limits. If you're new, join us and prepare yourself psychologically. Today we learn about the experience of Ethan, 29, from Duluth, Minnesota. He accepted a job at an isolated weather station, but what he found hidden among the pine trees changed his life forever. Turn off the lights, turn up the volume, and listen carefully. Isolation has never been so dangerous. Man, you have no idea what a relief it is to be able to talk about this with someone who won't immediately call me crazy. I spent months keeping this bottled up, feeling a weight on my chest that felt like it was going to suffocate me at any moment. You know that feeling when you think if you don't tell someone, your head is just going to explode? That's it. It all started when I accepted a job monitoring data at a private weather station in the far north of Minnesota near the border. The salary was ridiculously good, something I could never get in a normal city office. The contract said I would have to stay isolated in a tech booth for 3 months, just checking the servers and ensuring that the weather readings were sent to headquarters. In my arrogance, thinking that solitude was a gift, I accepted immediately. The place was in the middle of a forest so dense that sunlight barely touched the ground in some parts. When I got there, the air was so cold it felt like it cut my face, and the silence, my friend, the silence of that forest was not relaxing. It was a heavy silence, as if nature itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Duluth is already a cold and isolated city compared to other places, but that specific point on the map seemed to have been forgotten by God. I was miles from the main road, surrounded by gigantic pine trees that seemed like sentinels, watching my every step. In the first few days, I tried to convince myself that it was just the strangeness of the place, but deep down, I felt that something was wrong. The cabin was modern, all surrounded by metal and reinforced glass, but that protection seemed like paper against the dark immensity that began just beyond the balcony. On the third night, things started to get strange in a way I could no longer ignore. I was sitting in front of the monitors, the bluish glow of the screens the only light in the room, besides a weak lamp in the corner. Outside, it was pitch black. You know that kind of darkness where you reach out and can't see your own fingers. It was exactly like that. Suddenly I felt a chill run up my spine and stop at the nape of my neck, making every hair on my body stand on end. You know that visceral feeling that someone or something is staring at you? I tried to ignore it, focusing on the atmospheric pressure graphs, but the feeling only intensified. That's when I stupidly decided to look out the large glass window overlooking the eastern part of the forest. At first I only saw my own reflection, tired and pale, but then, as my eyes adjusted to the dim light outside, I saw. Right at the edge of the light escaping the cabin, there was a pair of eyes. But they weren't animal eyes, like a wolf or a bear. They were tall eyes, positioned about 2.5 meters from the ground. They didn't shine with the reflection of light. They seemed to absorb everything around them. They were opaque, yellowish, and full of a malevolent intelligence that paralyzed me instantly. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. We stayed there for what seemed like hours, just staring at us through the glass. The creature didn't move. It simply existed there, in that darkness, studying me as if I were an insect inside a glass jar. After that first visual encounter, sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. I spent the entire night awake, kitchen knife in hand, sitting on the sofa and staring at the door. I know, A knife against something that size sounds like a joke, but it was the only thing that gave me a shred of security. When the sun finally rose, I went outside to inspect the area, trying to find footprints or any sign that I wasn't going crazy. And I found some. But they weren't ordinary footprints. They were deep marks in the frozen earth, something resembling a human foot, but excessively long and with claws that had torn the ground. What scared me most was that the marks surrounded the entire cabin. He had walked around where I slept several times, just observing. That afternoon, while I was trying to focus on work, I started hearing something through the station's external audio system. The high-sensitivity microphone picked up a sound that seemed like crying. But it was a distorted cry, as if someone was trying to imitate a child, but didn't know exactly how humans produce that sound. It was something guttural, dragging, coming from the middle of the trees. I knew there weren't any children for miles around. I lived alone in that isolated region, and the nearest town was a 3-hour drive away on a dirt road. That sound wasn't a cry for help. It was bait. I felt my stomach churn. That thing was trying to lure me out. It wanted curiosity or empathy to pull me out of the safety of the metal walls. The tension inside that cabin was becoming physical. I felt as if the air was getting thicker with each passing hour. On the 5th night, the cold outside dropped drastically, and a thick fog began to rise from the ground, engulfing the tree trunks. I was in the kitchen, trying to make coffee to stay alert, when I heard a dry sound coming from the main room. It wasn't a loud noise, more like something heavy being dragged against the glass. I ran there, and what I saw made me drop my mug. There was a handprint on the window pane. But it wasn't a normal hand. The fingers were excessively long, with joints that seemed out of place, and the palm was narrow, leaving a trail of something that looked like a fetid greyish grease on the tempered glass. The smell began to seep in through the ventilation cracks. It was a smell of rotting flesh mixed with wet earth and something chemical like ammonia. I started to feel nauseous. Worst of all, I realized the mark was high up, far above where any normal man could reach without a ladder. The creature was there, on the other side of that glass, and the only thing separating us was a layer of material that, at that moment, seemed as fragile as paper. I turned off all the lights in the cabin, hoping the darkness would hide me. But I knew it could see me perfectly. It didn't need light. It felt my fear. It felt the heat of my body and the erratic beating of my heart. I spent the rest of that night huddled in the darkest corner of the room, far from any window. I began obsessively searching through the old files of that weather station, looking for reports from former employees. What I found chilled my blood. There were notes hidden in log files that shouldn't have been there. Short phrases like, "He speaks with my mother's voice," "His face changes," and "Don't look at the trees." The last employee hadn't resigned. He had simply disappeared. The company had registered it as job abandonment, but all his things were still there when I arrived. His clothes, his photos, even his diary was hidden under the floorboards of the room. I opened the diary, and the last pages were just frantic scribbles of a tall, thin figure with horns that looked like dry branches, and skin that seemed to be stretched over bones. It was then that I understood I wasn't dealing with an animal or an ordinary intruder. I was in the territory of something ancient, something that science couldn't explain, but that local legends called the Wendigo. He wasn't just watching me. He was circling me, testing my defenses, waiting for the exact moment my mind would break. And I felt that moment was coming. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, without a firearm, since company policy prohibited weapons on the station because of the sensitive equipment. I had only my wits about me and a desperate will to survive. But there, in the heart of the Minnesota forest, the will to live sometimes isn't enough. And to understand the level of my isolation, you need to picture where I was. Duluth is already a somewhat rustic place, but I was far beyond that, immersed in what they call the Upper National Forest. It's an immensity of pines and oaks that seems endless. In the summer, it must be beautiful, but in the winter it becomes a grey and white graveyard. The weather station was on top of a rocky elevation, surrounded by a ravine on one side and dense forest on the other. There were no neighbors, no forest patrol nearby, nothing. The scenery was cruelly beautiful. The trees were so tall and so close together that, even during the day, the forest floor remained in constant twilight. The snow wasn't fluffy. It was a rigid crust that cracked under the weight of anything, creating a dry sound that echoed through the trunks. The cabin itself was a metal and tempered glass box, mounted on steel pillars to keep out moisture and animals. There was a generator in the back that hummed day and night, and that was the only human sound I heard. But that engine hum, which should have given me comfort, began to bother me. It seemed to be masking other sounds coming from the forest. I spent hours looking at the topographic map on the computer screen, seeing the contour lines, and realizing that I was in a communication black hole. The radio only picked up the company frequency at specific times, and the internet was limited to sending weather data. I was trapped in a cage of technological luxury, surrounded by nature that seemed to want to expel me from there at any cost. The sky was always overcast, with heavy clouds that seemed to touch the tops of the pine trees, creating a feeling of claustrophobia even in such an open space. You know, I'm not one to be picky about smells. After all, I've camped everywhere. But what started to permeate that cabin was something out of this world. It wasn't the smell of a common dead animal, like a skunk or a deer that had rotted in the woods. It was a mixture of rotten meat with something chemical, a smell of ammonia or ozone, something that assaulted my nose and made my eyes water. I cleaned the ventilation ducts 3 times, thinking some rat had died in there, but I didn't find anything. The smell came from outside, but it was so strong it seemed to penetrate the metal walls. One afternoon, the wind changed direction and brought this odor with an absurd force. I had to plug my nose with a cloth soaked in alcohol to avoid vomiting. It was at that moment that I realized the creature was close. Very close. It didn't smell like a living animal, it smelled like death walking. I also started to notice that the birds had disappeared. You know when you go into the woods and you hear those animal noises all the time? Well, there was absolute silence there. Not even the crows, which are common in that region, appeared anymore. It was as if the presence of that thing had created a dead zone around the station. I would go out onto the balcony and feel the heavy air, charged with static electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand on end all the time. The sensation was that I was being slowly cooked in a broth of terror, and the seasoning was that unbearable smell that seemed to cling to my skin, my hair, everything. I would shower and still feel the trace of that rot on my body. Many people ask me why I didn't just grab my things and run away at the first traffic light. Man, the answer is simple and sad. Money and desperation. I was drowning in debt in Duluth, 3 months behind on rent, and my car was about to be repossessed. That job was my only way out of homelessness. The contract had a very harsh termination clause. If I left before 3 months without a medical justification verified by their team, I wouldn't receive a penny and would still have to pay for the helicopter transport that got me there. I felt like a prisoner of my own failure. Besides, in the beginning, you always try to rationalize, right? I told myself, Ethan, it's just a big bear, or it's the isolation messing with your head. But with each passing day, that lie became harder to maintain. I spent my working hours looking at the external security cameras, which had thermal vision, but strangely, sometimes they showed cold blurs moving between the trees. Blurs that had human form, but were too big, too awkward. I called the control center on the radio, and they said it was just atmospheric interference due to the intense cold. They didn't want to know. To them, I was just a number operating a machine. I was alone with my demons, and with that thing that was out there, prowling around me like a wolf stalks a wounded sheep. Social isolation is one thing, but existential isolation, where you know that if you die, no one will miss you for weeks, is a terror that corrodes the soul from within. It was in the second week that the psychological horror reached its peak. I was trying to sleep, using earplugs to see if I could get at least 4 hours of rest, when I heard a voice. It wasn't just any voice, it was my brother Mark's voice. But Mark lives in Chicago, man. He couldn't possibly be there. His voice came from outside the cabin, from somewhere near the generators. He was calling me by my childhood nickname, the one only my family knows. "Hey, T-Bone, open up, man. It's freezing. I got lost on the trail." My first reaction was pure joy. I almost got up to open the door, but then a snap of sanity hit me like a punch. How would he know where I was? How could he have gotten there without a vehicle? And most importantly, his voice was wrong. It had the same timbre, the same cadence, but it sounded like a recording played at a slightly slower speed, with a metallic vibration underneath. I approached the window without turning on the light and looked down. There was no one near the generators. The voice continued, repeating the same phrase with the exact same intonation as if it were a loop. "Hey, T-Bone, open up, man. It's freezing." I felt such great dread that my legs gave way and I fell to the floor. That thing was using my memories, or perhaps it was picking up something from my mind to lure me outside. It knew who I loved. It knew how to get to me. I covered my ears tightly and began to pray, even though I'm not religious. The voice continued for hours, alternating between my brother's voice and the voice of an old college friend who had died in an accident. It was playing with me, testing which voice would have the most effect on my willingness to open that door. After that night of the voices, the creature stopped hiding so much. He wanted me to know he was in control. During the day, I found things left on the cabin stairs. Once it was a perfectly skinned bird carcass, without a drop of blood on the ground. Another time it was stones arranged in a perfect circle, with a human tooth in the middle. I don't know where he got that tooth, and I'd rather not think about it. I started hearing scratching on the station's metal walls at night. They weren't scratches from an animal trying to get in. They were slow, deliberate, as if someone were running a metal fingernail along the metal just to keep me awake. I saw his silhouette pass by the windows with an impossible speed for something that size. He was tall, very thin, with skin that looked like old leather stretched over a humanoid skeleton. His arms were too long, the joints seemed to bend in the wrong directions. And his face, man, his face was the worst. He had no nose, just slits, and his eyes were those yellowish spheres I saw the first night. He had no fur, but something that looked like moss or dirt clung to his grey skin. He would stand at the edge of the forest, just staring at me, sometimes for hours. I realized he wasn't in a hurry. He was waiting for me to break. He wanted fear to consume me until I had no strength left to resist. I was losing my appetite, my hair was falling out in clumps from stress, and I was trembling constantly. I knew that at any moment he would tire of playing and decide it was dinner time, and I, there in that cabin, was the main course, served on an insulated tray with ice. In the third week, what had been a game of stalking had turned into a display of pure violence. I woke to a metallic clang coming from the platform where the generator was located. It wasn't the sound of something breaking, but rather of something being used as a table. When daylight finally broke that gray, dead Minnesota light, I looked out the kitchen window. What I saw made me fall to my knees and vomit what little was left in my stomach. The top of the generator was covered in blood, but it wasn't fresh, red blood. It was something dark, almost black and viscous. In the middle of that pool was what remained of a huge male deer. But it hadn't been eaten in a normal way, like a wolf would. The animal had been opened from neck to tail with surgical precision, and all the internal organs had been removed and arranged around the carcass as if it were a ritual. The most bizarre thing, man, and this is what keeps me up at night to this day, is that the creature didn't eat the meat. She simply tore the animal apart and left it there as a gift or a warning. I realized he was showing me what he was capable of. He had the strength to tear a 200-kilogram deer in half and the dexterity not to break a single bone if he didn't want to. The smell of death was now constant, as the blood froze on the hot metal of the generator and exuded that metallic and rotten odor every time the engine revved. I was surrounded by a cemetery he himself was building around me, and the next piece in that collection I knew very well would be me. Things started to go wrong. First it was the radio. I tried to tune into the frequency of the control center in Duluth to call for emergency rescue, but all I heard was heavy static, and in the middle of that static, I could make out that laugh. It wasn't a human laugh. It was a dry sound, like branches banging together, but with a mocking rhythm that made me shiver. Then the heating system started to fluctuate. In the middle of the night, the temperature in the cabin dropped below freezing, and I had to wrap myself in 4 thermal blankets, feeling the ice forming on the interior walls. I knew he was doing it. He was messing with the external wiring, cutting and reconnecting cables just to see my reaction. He wanted me to get out to fix it. He wanted the cold to force me to open the door. I spent all day with my laptop on my lap, desperately trying to send an SOS signal, but the satellite connection was being blocked by something. Whenever I tried to send the email, the screen would flicker and random characters would appear, forming the image of that face I saw in the windows. Technology, which should have been my shield, had become a tool in his hands to psychologically torture me. I felt like a rat in a maze, where the walls were getting narrower and narrower, and the scientist was an ancient monster who amused himself with my suffering. The isolation was total. I was hundreds of kilometers from civilization, without radio, without stable internet, and with the warmth slowly fading away. The 4th week brought the most disturbing visual horror I've ever seen. I was trying to maintain some semblance of sanity, reading and rereading the previous employee's diary, when I heard a light knock on the front door. It wasn't a kick or a scratch. It was a polite 3-touch knock. I froze. I looked through the reinforced peephole, and my heart nearly stopped. On the other side, under the dim light of the porch, was my father. My father, who died 5 years ago in Duluth. He was wearing the same flannel jacket he was buried in. He looked real. His skin had the right texture. His beard was trimmed the way he liked it. But when he opened his mouth to speak, the illusion shattered. His jaw dropped lower than biologically possible, and the voice that came out wasn't his. It was an amalgam of all the voices I'd ever heard in my life, mixed into a dissonant chorus. "Ethan, my son, let your old man in. It's so cold out here." I saw his hands, or what were supposed to be his hands. The skin on his fingertips was peeling, revealing sharp black claws beneath the human mask. He wasn't my father. He was that thing wearing my father's memory like an old coat. The beast was using my grief against me. I started screaming, telling him to go to hell, and the creature simply stopped pretending. My father's face distorted, the skin stretched to tear at the corners of his mouth, and he let out a silent roar, barely showing rows of sharp teeth before disappearing into the darkness of the forest with a leap that covered 10 meters at a time. I squeezed myself into the technical basement of the cabin, a small space where the routers and power panels were located. It was the only place without windows. It was there that I found something that changed my perspective on the company that hired me. Hidden behind a metal panel was an old voice recorder. I pressed play and listened to the voices of at least 3 different monitors who had passed through there before me. They all described the same progression: the smell, the eyes, the voices, and finally, the siege. The last report was from a guy named Thompson. He said, his voice trembling, that the company knew what lived in those woods. They weren't measuring the weather, they were feeding the monster. The weather station was a modern altar, and we, the employees, were the periodic sacrifice to keep the thing in its territory and away from the larger cities. Thompson mentioned that regular lead bullets didn't work, that he'd tried shooting it with a pistol he'd smuggled inside, and the thing just laughed while the wounds instantly closed. He said the only way to keep the creature away for a while was fire, but the Minnesota cold was so intense that keeping a flame alive outside was nearly impossible. The audio ended with the sound of the front door being ripped off its hinges and Thompson yelling something about the man with the changed skin. I realized I wasn't an employee. I was the offering this time. Anger began to replace fear. If I was going to die, I wasn't going to make it easy for that creature. The monster's patience ran out the following night. The wind was howling outside, a blizzard of the kind that buries cars in minutes, when I heard the first real bang. It wasn't on the door, but on the roof. It had leaped from one of the gigantic trees straight onto the metal roof of the cabin. The impact was so strong that the LED lights on the ceiling exploded, leaving me in total darkness except for the flashlight I had strapped to my belt. I heard the sound of metal being ripped apart like a sardine can. The beast was using its claws to blast a hole in the reinforced roof. The cold began to creep in with brutal force, bringing with it snowflakes and that unbearable smell of carrion. I grabbed every flammable product I could find: lighter fluid, spray cans of cleaning fluid, cleaning alcohol from the servers. I knew it was right above me. I saw the black claws piercing the thermal insulation, descending like knives. The noise was deafening, a creaking of bent steel that echoed throughout the structure. I crawled to the opposite corner, preparing a makeshift trap with a gallon of generator fuel I'd brought inside as a precaution. The cabin, my only refuge, was now breached. The predator was no longer knocking on the door. It had decided to tear the whole house down. I looked up and, for a brief second, the light from my flashlight caught a glimpse of that grey, dead skin sliding down the hole. It was getting in. When the first piece of metal from the ceiling finally gave way, the sound wasn't an explosion, but an agonizing stretching of steel. The cold that rushed in felt like a whip to my face, mixed with that fine snow that looked like glass dust. I had the trembling tactical flashlight in my left hand and the fuel can in my right. Through the hole, I saw the yellowish glint of those eyes. He wasn't in a hurry. He stuck his head through the hole, and what I saw was the face of a man, but a man who had been stretched to the limit of sanity. His skin was grey, the colour of a corpse that had lain in the snow for weeks, and it was so close to the bones that you could see every joint of his jaw moving. He looked at me, and for a second time stopped. It wasn't the look of a hunting animal. It was the look of something that took pleasure in my despair. He let out a heavy breath, and the smell of rotting flesh filled the cabin in a way that made my stomach clench. I didn't wait for him to come down completely. I knew that if he touched the ground, I was a dead man. I threw the fuel toward the hole, but my hands were shaking so much that half of it fell to the floor and the server counter. The creature sensed the movement and, with gravity-defying agility, propelled itself inside, landing on its feet less than 3 meters from me. He was tall, man, really tall. His neck was long and crooked, and his arms almost reached his knees. He stood there studying me, while the snow fell on his bony shoulders. I recoiled until my back hit the cold kitchen wall. The skinwalker began to move, but not normally. He walked spasmodically, as if his muscles were fighting against his own bones. With each step, I heard the dry crack of his joints settling, a sound like tree branches breaking in winter. He reached out and touched the table where I ate my meals. His nails, black and chipped, left deep grooves in the solid wood. Suddenly, his mouth opened impossibly, and he began to speak. But it wasn't my father's or my brother's voice now. It was my own voice. "Ethan, you can't run from yourself," he said, using exactly my tone, my cadence, even my hesitation between words. Hearing my own voice coming from that evil carcass was the final blow to my courage. I mentally collapsed for a second, but the survival instinct prevailed. I took the lighter from my pocket, the one I used for emergencies, and struck it. The small flame looked like a beacon in the darkness. The creature stopped instantly. It tilted its head to the side like a curious bird, and for the first time I saw fear, or perhaps just a deep irritation, in those yellowish eyes. It knew what fire meant. It took a step back, growling a sound, like the bubbling of hot mud, and I realized that this was my only chance. If I didn't set this place on fire now, I would never get out of there alive. I didn't think twice. I threw the lit lighter into the puddle of fuel I had spilled across the counter and floor. In an instant, the fire rose, creating a wall of orange flames between me and the creature. The heat was so intense that my eyebrows singed instantly. The skinwalker let out a silent scream, opening its mouth and exposing rows of teeth that looked like bone needles, and retreated into the shadows at the back of the cabin. The fire alarm system began to beep, a sharp, insistent sound that mixed with the roar of the flames consuming the plastics and papers. I knew I had little time before the toxic smoke would kill me. I grabbed the emergency backpack I had already prepared near the side door, the one that led to the metal walkway. I ran out, kicking the door with all my might. The cold air of the blizzard outside hit me like a punch, but it was a relief compared to the infernal heat inside. I glanced back for a second and saw his silhouette through the flames. He wasn't burning. He was walking through the fire. His skin seemed to bubble, but he didn't stop. He wanted his prey. I jumped from the walkway straight into the soft snow, sinking up to my waist. I needed to get to the shed where the snowmobile was, my only hope of escape. But the snow was too deep, and each step felt like I was carrying tons of lead on my legs. I heard the sound of the cabin exploding behind me. The fire probably hit some gas tank or the large capacitors on the servers. The light from the explosion illuminated the forest for a few seconds, and that's when I saw him. He had jumped through the broken window and was coming towards me, running on all fours like a wolf, but with that humanoid body all disjointed. He was much faster than me in that condition. I reached the shed and my hands were so frozen I could barely turn the padlock key. I could hear his footsteps approaching, the sound of the snow being compacted forcefully and quickly. The moment the padlock opened, I felt a violent tug on my backpack. He had caught me. His claws tore the fabric of the backpack and grazed my back, opening cuts that I only didn't feel at the time because of the adrenaline and the cold. I threw myself inside the shed and slammed the heavy wooden door, locking the bolt from the inside. I was in total darkness, smelling gasoline and oil. On the other side of the door, I heard the impact of his body. His shoulders were slamming against the wood, making everything tremble. I groped around until I found the snowmobile. I needed it to start right away. If the engine failed, I was trapped in a wooden shed that he would knock down in minutes. I mounted the snowmobile and pulled the starter cord with all the force of my desperation. Nothing, just a dry, metallic sound. I pulled again, and the engine gave a sign of life, but then died. Outside, the blows on the door were getting louder. I could see the wood beginning to crack. The skinwalker was using its own head to break down the entrance. I could hear the cracking of its skull against the oak. On the third try, the engine roared and came to life, releasing a cloud of bluish smoke into the shed. I didn't wait. I accelerated as hard as I could and crashed through the shed door, shattering the already weakened wood. I felt the snowmobile hit something heavy. It was him. The impact threw the creature aside, and I saw its body roll in the snow before I sped off into the forest. I didn't look back. I just focused on the beam of light from the snowmobile's headlight, trying to avoid the trees and rocks. But the horror wasn't over. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw 2 yellow dots following me, gaining ground. He wasn't chasing me. He was leaping from tree to tree, keeping pace with the motorcycle's speed with frightening ease. I was being hunted by a tireless predator on his territory, with only half a tank of fuel and a blizzard obscuring any visibility. I knew the main road was miles away, and every meter traveled was a battle against the fear that the engine would stall or that he would jump on me at any moment. The snowmobile roared beneath me, but that sound, which had once seemed powerful, now sounded like a toy against the vastness of the forest. I accelerated as much as the engine would allow, feeling the machine vibrate violently against my arms. The blizzard was so dense that the snowmobile's headlight created only a tunnel of blinding white light, where tree trunks appeared out of nowhere like wooden ghosts. I glanced in the rear-view mirror, and for a second, the light from the explosion in the cabin, still gleaming in the distance, revealed his silhouette. He wasn't running like an animal, man. He was making impossible leaps, using the lowest pine branches to propel himself forward. It was a fluid and terrifying movement, as if he were swimming through the icy air. I felt the cuts on my back burn from the contact with the snow, but the pain was just background noise. My focus was on the trail. I knew that if I missed the path by a meter, the snowmobile would flip over and I would be a dead man in seconds. The skinwalker was gaining ground. At one point, I saw it out of the corner of my eye, running parallel to me between the trees, its head turned toward me, its yellow eyes fixed on my neck. It let out a sound that wasn't a scream. It was a laugh made of bone cracking, a final taunt before the pounce. I dodged a fallen log at the last second, feeling the creature's breath brush past me as it attempted an aerial attack that nearly knocked me off my motorcycle. I was almost out of fuel. The gauge had been in the red for a long time. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel the beats in my ears competing with the engine noise. Suddenly, the forest began to open up. I recognized the terrain. I was getting close to the interstate highway. But the creature knew this too. It couldn't let its prey escape to where there was light and other humans. In an act of desperation, the monster leaped directly in front of the motorcycle. I didn't have time to brake. I just gripped the handlebars tightly and prayed the impact wouldn't kill me. The motorcycle struck the thing's chest with brutal force. I felt the impact reverberate throughout my body, heard the sound of ribs breaking, but they weren't human ribs. They sounded like old wood being crushed. The motorcycle reared up. I almost lost control, but the creature's weight was thrown to the side. I didn't stop to see if it was dead or injured. I accelerated using what little fuel I had left, until the tires, the skids, touched the icy asphalt of the main road. In the distance, I saw the glint of headlights. They were real lights, warm and yellow, coming from a cargo truck. I steered the motorcycle into the middle of the lane and began waving frantically, shouting in a voice I didn't even recognize as my own. The truck driver, a huge guy named Bill, whom I'll never forget, stopped the vehicle a few meters from me. He got out with a shocked expression, seeing a man covered in blood and snow, riding a smoking snowmobile in the middle of nowhere. I fell off the snowmobile as soon as the engine finally died from lack of gas. I couldn't speak. I just pointed to the darkness of the forest where I had come from. Bill helped me into the truck cab, which seemed like the safest place in the universe. He had a CB radio and a thermos of hot coffee. As the truck picked up speed, I looked out the side window. For a brief moment, under the light of the truck's taillights, I saw a figure standing on the side of the road. It was him. He was standing, erect like a man, but with his arms hanging almost to the ground. He didn't follow me down the road. He just stood there, watching the truck drive away, and then with a slow movement he brought his hand to his chest where the motorcycle had hit him, and then put his fingers to his mouth, as if tasting his own blood, or mine. He disappeared into the darkness before I could blink. Bill took me to a gas station with a diner in a small town called Orr. There, people looked at me as if I were a ghost. I was pale, my clothes were torn, and I had the look of someone who had seen the bottom of the abyss. 2 days later, while I was still in the hospital being treated for hypothermia and cuts on my back, 2 men in suits appeared in my room. They weren't police, nor from any forestry agency. They introduced themselves as legal representatives of the monitoring company. They didn't ask how I was. They just placed a leather briefcase on my bed. Inside, there was a confidentiality agreement and a check for an amount that would solve all my financial problems in Duluth and still leave plenty left over. They told me that the weather station had suffered a catastrophic electrical accident and that there was no trace of anything but ashes. When I tried to talk about the creature, the older man looked at me with eyes as cold as the skinwalker's and said that if I mentioned any delirium caused by isolation, The insurance wouldn't cover my medical costs, and I would be prosecuted for criminal negligence for the fire on company property. They wiped everything out, man. They went back there, cleaned up the remains of the generator, took the recorder I had found, everything. To the world, Ethan was just an employee who had a breakdown in the middle of nowhere and nearly killed himself in a fire. But I know what I saw. I feel the scars on my back itch every time the temperature drops below zero. Today, I live in a big city, far from any forest. I even avoid municipal parks. But the problem, my friend, is that the fear didn't stay in Minnesota. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up to the sound of a voice coming from the hallway of my apartment. It's my mother's voice, or Bill, the truck driver's voice. They call me to open the door, saying it's cold outside. I know it's not them. I know that thing, or something of its kind, is still out there, shedding its skin, using our memories as bait. I accepted the company's money, paid my debts, but I haven't slept a full night since. What I experienced there taught me that civilization is just a thin layer of ice over an ocean of horrors that we are not prepared to understand. If you ever receive a job offer that's too good to be true, in a place where the silence is too heavy, do yourself a favor. Stay poor, but stay alive. Because in those forests, what watches you at night doesn't want your work. It wants your existence, piece by piece, voice by voice, and it has all the time in the world to wait for you to make the mistake of opening the door. This was one of the most disturbing accounts we've ever shared about what truly lurks in the isolation of the forests. Ethan's experience in Minnesota serves as a grim warning that danger can often use a familiar face to lure us into the darkness. If after hearing this you felt the need to check if your doors are securely locked, then I know I've accomplished my goal. Ethan's journey at that weather station may have come to an end, but what he faced continues out there, waiting in the shadows. Enjoy this video if you manage to follow this account to the end without looking away. Comment below which moment made you most uncomfortable and share this video with that person who needs a good reason not to walk alone at night. And most importantly, if you have the courage to listen to what others prefer to keep silent about, sign up for Confessions of Dark Fiction and turn on notifications. That way, you'll ensure you're never truly alone when the silence gets too much. I'll be here, waiting for you, for our next confession in the shadows.